In the summer of 2015, inside a genetics lab at Harvard Medical School, a young researcher named Pontus Skoglund was staring at rows of genetic data when he noticed something that made no sense. He was studying DNA collected years earlier from indigenous groups in Brazil, checking and rechecking the numbers because he assumed he had made an error. Two small tribes living deep in the Amazon rainforest, tribes that had barely had contact with the outside world, were showing a genetic signal that should not have existed. Their DNA carried traces connecting them not to their neighbors in South America, not to any group in Siberia, not to anyone in Asia. It was connecting them to Aboriginal Australians and the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea, populations separated from the Amazon by an entire ocean and roughly 15,000 years of history. Skoglund would later admit that his first reaction was not excitement. It was confusion bordering on disbelief, because if this signal was real, it meant that somewhere in the deep past, a group of people nobody had ever documented, a population that had vanished completely from the historical and archaeological record, had reached the Amazon rainforest and left a piece of themselves buried inside a hidden bloodline that no one, not the tribes themselves, not a single anthropologist in over a century of study, had ever known was there. To understand how strange this discovery really is, you need to go back further, to a moment in 1969, when a small Tupi-speaking group known as the Surui made first contact with the modern world. For generations, the Surui had lived in near total isolation in the rainforests of the western Amazon, cut off from outside contact by choice and by geography, protected by dense jungle that swallowed roads and made outsiders unwelcome. When contact finally happened in 1969, it was treated by anthropologists as a landmark moment, a rare chance to study a population that had remained almost completely untouched by the modern world. Nobody at the time had any reason to suspect that buried inside the DNA of these forest-dwelling people was a genetic fingerprint connecting them to islands on the other side of the planet. That secret would stay hidden for another 46 years, quietly encoded in blood and cells, waiting for the right scientific tools to finally read it. The story that eventually forced this secret into the open began with a much bigger question that had puzzled scientists for decades. How exactly did humans first arrive in the Americas? The accepted textbook answer, the one taught in classrooms for generations, was simple and clean. Roughly 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels dropped low enough to expose a strip of land connecting Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge known as Beringia. Small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed that bridge on foot, then spread south, eventually populating both continents from the Arctic all the way down to the southern tip of Chile. This single founding population, often called the first Americans, was believed to be the ancestral source for every indigenous group across North, Central, and South America. It was a tidy, singular story, and it was about to be blown apart by a research team that decided to actually test it properly. Skoglund, working alongside geneticist David Reich, decided to dig deeper into a strange pattern he had first spotted while reviewing genetic data gathered back in 2012. He noticed a subtle but persistent similarity between one or two Native American groups from Brazil and indigenous populations from Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands, a chain of islands in the Indian Ocean. At first, the finding seemed almost too strange to be real, and Reich later described his own reaction as unexpected and deeply confusing. But rather than dismiss it, the team decided to test it properly. They partnered with researchers in Brazil to gather fresh genetic samples directly from Amazonian communities, eventually analyzing the genomes of 30 different Native American groups spread across Central and South America. Using separate statistical methods to cross-check their results, they compared these genomes against one another and against samples from 197 populations from around the entire globe. If this Australasian signal was some kind of fluke or contamination, running it through for independent tests should have made it disappear. It did not disappear, it got stronger. 3 specific Amazonian groups stood out clearly above the rest: the Surui, the Caradiana, and the Xavante. Each of these tribes showed a genetic ancestor that was more closely related to indigenous Australasian populations than to any other population living on Earth today, including every other Native American group across the entire Western Hemisphere. This wasn't a small statistical wobble either. The connection was consistent, it was measurable, and critically, it did not show up anywhere else in the Americas. Native American populations in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the rest of South America showed nothing like it. Whatever had happened, it seemed to be locked almost exclusively inside these isolated pockets of the Amazon rainforest. Naturally, the first assumption scientists had to rule out was recent contamination, some kind of modern mixing that could explain the pattern, without requiring any dramatic ancient story. Maybe European sailors, African traders, or Polynesian voyagers had introduced this DNA sometime after Columbus arrived in the Americas. The team tested for exactly that possibility, and the geographic pattern simply could not be explained by any post-Columbian mixture involving European, African, or Polynesian populations mixing with Native Americans. Whatever the source was, it long predated recorded history. Researchers concluded that this genetic marker, and the population that carried it, most likely dated back to the very earliest period of human migration into the Americas, meaning this hidden lineage had been sitting silently inside these tribes for as long as 15,000 years, passed down invisibly through hundreds of generations, with absolutely nobody aware it was there. The team gave this vanished, mysterious ancestral group a name. They called it Population Y, borrowing the word from the Tupi language, where Epiquera means ancestor. It was a fitting name because Population Y represented exactly that, an ancestor with no living descendants anywhere else on Earth, no modern population that resembled them, and no trace of their existence outside the blood of a handful of Amazonian tribes. Reich explained that decades of genetic sampling across East Asia had never turned up anything close to this signature. In his own words, it was an unknown group that simply does not exist anymore. Whoever these people were, wherever exactly they came from, they had vanished so completely from history that modern science could only detect them as a ghost, a shadow reconstructed entirely from statistical patterns hidden inside the DNA of their distant descendants. Here's where the mystery deepens even further, because scientists still cannot agree on exactly how much of this hidden ancestry these tribes actually carry. Depending on how you interpret the data, researchers found that roughly 2% of the ancestry of Amazonian populations traces back to this unexplained Australasian lineage, a figure that isn't found anywhere else in the Americas in the same way. But that 2% figure comes with an enormous asterisk attached to it. If Population Y arrived in the Americas as a completely separate, unmixed group, then 2% would represent the entire contribution they made to modern Amazonian DNA. However, if Population Y had already mixed with other wholly migrant groups, such as the first Americans, before they ever reached the Amazon, the real percentage of their genetic contribution could be dramatically higher, potentially reaching as high as 85% of certain ancestral components within these tribes. That is not a small technical footnote. That is the difference between a faint genetic echo and an entire hidden branch of human ancestry that has been sitting in plain sight, misidentified for over a century, inside people who never knew it was there. The only way to truly settle that question would be to obtain actual DNA directly from the remains of someone who belonged to Population Y itself, rather than only studying the diluted traces left behind in their living descendants. As of the original 2015 findings, that kind of direct sample simply did not exist. Nobody had ever found or identified skeletal remains that could be confirmed as belonging to this vanished population. It left researchers in an almost eerie position, certain that something real and significant had happened deep in the ancient past, certain that an entire group of humans had made an impossibly long journey and left a permanent mark on a small cluster of Amazonian tribes, and yet completely unable to look that population directly in the eye, because every trace of them beyond this genetic echo had disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. Interestingly, this wasn't actually the very first hint that something unusual connected Amazonian populations to the other side of the world. Long before modern DNA sequencing existed, physical anthropologists studying ancient skeletal remains unearthed in Brazil and Colombia had already noticed something strange about the shape of certain skulls. These ancient skulls bore a stronger resemblance to the skull shapes typically found in Australasian populations than to the skull shapes of other Native American remains. For years, this observation sat in an uncomfortable scientific limbo. Some anthropologists pointed to it as possible evidence supporting more than one distinct founding population arriving in the Americas. Others dismissed the resemblance entirely, arguing it was simply a coincidental byproduct of different groups adapting to similar environments and similar diets, nothing more than superficial convergence. The problem, As one outside anthropologist bluntly put it, was that there had never been strong genetic evidence to actually support the skull-based theory, one way or the other. Bones, after all, can only be measured and interpreted in so many different ways, and skull shape alone was never going to be enough to settle the argument. Genes, on the other hand, make a far more concrete and much harder to dismiss case. When the 2015 genetic data landed and lined up almost perfectly with what those old, controversial skull measurements had been hinting at for decades, it suddenly turned a fringe theory that many scientists had quietly written off into a legitimate, evidence-backed piece of a much larger and far stranger puzzle. Of course, no discovery this dramatic escaped scrutiny, and plenty of scientists pushed back hard. Cecil Lewis Jr., an anthropological geneticist at the University of Oklahoma, raised a serious and fair warning, pointing out that Amazonian populations generally have low genetic diversity and are far more susceptible to a statistical phenomenon called genetic drift, where random chance alone can create the illusion of a meaningful ancestral connection where none actually exists. It was a valid concern, and it forced the wider scientific community to demand independent confirmation before fully accepting population Y as real. That confirmation arrived from an entirely separate research group. A team led by Eske Willerslev and Mun Osaragoven at the University of Copenhagen published their own independent investigation the very same day, in the journal Science. Their conclusions were similar in spirit but different in the details, proposing that Native Americans descended from a single migratory line that crossed the Beringen Land Bridge no earlier than 23,000 years ago. While their study didn't focus specifically on Amazonian tribes in depth, they still detected a weaker version of the same Australasian link showing up in some South American populations, though they initially attributed it to a completely different and much later source, gene flow connected to Arctic populations sometimes referred to as Eskimo groups. But that alternative explanation ran into an immediate, glaring problem. If the connection really came from later contact involving Arctic populations moving south, you would expect to find genetic evidence of that same Australasian connection scattered along the entire migration route, showing up in populations across North America and Central America as this signal supposedly traveled southward toward the Amazon. It simply was not there. The signal was suspiciously, almost surgically confined to a small number of isolated groups deep in the Amazon, with virtually nothing connecting the dots in between. Reich argued this made the alternative Arctic explanation a poor fit for the actual data. Both competing research teams, despite disagreeing on the finer mechanical details, ultimately arrived at the same unsettling bottom line: that the true ancestry of the first people to reach the Americas was significantly more complicated, more layered, and stranger than anyone in the scientific community had previously imagined. For years after the initial 2015 discovery, population Y remained a strange, unresolved footnote, fascinating but frustratingly incomplete, a genetic ghost story without a satisfying ending. Then, in March of 2021, a new wave of research picked the mystery back up and pushed it significantly further. A team of scientists decided to test whether this Australasian signal was really as narrowly confined to a tiny handful of Amazonian tribes as everyone had assumed, or whether it might actually be hiding, undetected, in a much wider swath of indigenous South American populations. What they found rewrote the story yet again. The Australasian genetic signal turned out to be far more widespread across South America than researchers had originally believed, showing up not only among the original Amazonian groups but also detected among descendants connected to Peru's ancient Mochica civilization, an ancient culture located along the Pacific coast thousands of kilometers away from the deep Amazon interior where the signal was first identified. This new geographic spread completely reshaped the leading theory about how population Y's DNA actually made its way into the Amazon in the first place. Researchers proposed that the earliest migrants carrying this mysterious Australasian signal likely traveled down the Pacific coastline first, rather than cutting straight through the interior of the continent. Somewhere between roughly 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, these coastal travelers appeared to have split off from the main migratory path, with one branch continuing along the coast while another branch turned inland, eventually settling into the central Brazilian plateau and the deep Amazon basin where their descendants, the Surui, the Caritiana, and the Zavandi, still live today. One of the researchers involved described the newly discovered data as matching exactly what you would predict if that coastal migration scenario were correct: a satisfying click of pieces finally fitting neatly together after years of scientific uncertainty. Even scientists who had helped uncover the original 2015 signal welcomed this new evidence, noting it confirmed the original finding wasn't some kind of statistical artifact or fluke born from small sample sizes. It was, in fact, a real and genuinely widespread genetic signal, embedded far more broadly across the continent than anyone had initially dared to claim. Yet even with this significant progress, the deepest, most fundamental question at the heart of the entire mystery remains stubbornly, maddeningly unanswered to this very day. Who exactly were these people? Where did population Y originally come from before they ever set foot on the Beringen land bridge? Did they represent some entirely separate, previously unknown wave of ancient human migration that split off from other populations somewhere deep in Northeast Asia, long before reaching the Americas at all? Or does their unusual genetic signature actually trace back much further, to common ancestors shared broadly among all early Native American founding populations? Meaning the Australasian connection may not represent a separate group at all, but rather an ancient shared root buried at the very base of the human family tree that once linked ancient Asia all the way through to Australia and New Guinea. Different research teams have proposed genuinely conflicting answers to this exact question, and as more recent analysis has pointed out, there remains real ongoing debate about whether the entire signal might partially reflect deep shared ancestry from Northeast Asian populations, rather than requiring a totally separate migratory wave arriving independently in the Americas. Some scientists have even raised the uncomfortable possibility that the strange, patchy, and seemingly random distribution pattern of this signal across different populations could hint at lingering issues with false positive detections buried somewhere within the underlying statistical methods themselves. A technical worrying that keeps this entire scientific debate refreshingly and stubbornly open rather than definitively closed. What makes this story so genuinely unsettling, when you really sit with it, is not just the strange science itself, but the human dimension quietly buried underneath all of it. The Suru people who made first contact with the outside world back in 1969 had absolutely no way of knowing that their own bodies were secretly carrying a genetic connection to islands and communities on the complete opposite side of the planet. Their oral histories, passed carefully down through countless generations of ancestors, contained no memory whatsoever of any journey stretching all the way from Australia or New Guinea. Their own traditional origin stories made no mention of a lost, vanished founding population later dubbed Population Y by scientists thousands of miles away in a genetics lab. This deeply hidden secret wasn't something the tribe was actively concealing from the outside world. It was a secret their own bodies had been unknowingly keeping from them too, quietly encoded at the molecular level and passed down invisibly through roughly 600 generations. Only finally cracked open the moment cutting-edge genetic sequencing technology became sophisticated enough to actually read it. And there's an even deeper layer of irony buried inside this entire discovery. For centuries, indigenous Amazonian tribes were frequently viewed by outsiders through a narrow, static, almost timeless lens, as if they represented some kind of frozen, unchanging window directly into humanity's distant past, untouched relics from an earlier era of human history. This genetic research completely flips that outdated framing on its head. Far from being a simple, static population that stayed the same for thousands of years, the deep ancestry of these Amazonian tribes turns out to be layered, complicated, and quietly extraordinary. The living product of an ancient, extraordinarily long journey that potentially began somewhere near the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia, wound its way slowly across Beringia, traveled south along the Pacific coastline, and only then split off deep into the heart of the rainforest, where the story eventually settled and, for thousands upon thousands of years, sat completely silent and undiscovered. Scientists have made it clear that this particular mystery is still far from being fully solved. Researchers continue actively searching for actual ancient skeletal remains that might be conclusively confirmed as belonging to Population Y itself. Evidence that would allow them to move beyond indirect statistical inference and finally examine this vanished ancestral group directly, rather than only glimpsing faint traces of them through their modern descendants. Every fresh DNA sample collected from additional indigenous communities across South America has the very real potential to reshape this story yet again, either by uncovering the signal in entirely new populations nobody previously suspected, or by finally helping pin down more precisely when and exactly how this ancient, long-hidden migration actually unfolded across an entire ocean and a vanished Ice Age land bridge. What began as one confused researcher squinting skeptically at a computer screen back in 2015, convinced he had simply made some kind of embarrassing calculation error, ultimately turned into one of the strangest and most genuinely debated mysteries in the entire modern field of human genetics. A hidden ancestral population, with no name of its own beyond a scientific label pulled from an indigenous word simply meaning ancestor, managed to leave behind a barely perceptible genetic fingerprint on a small cluster of Amazon rainforest tribes, and then vanished completely and totally from every other corner of the historical and archaeological record on planet Earth. The Surui, the Caradiana, and the Zavandi people carry a piece of that vanished population inside them at this very moment, quietly written into their DNA. And until modern genetic science finally caught up enough to read that hidden code, not one single person alive, tribal elder or outside scientist alike, ever had any way of knowing that this profound, ancient secret was there at all.